Hello and welcome to this lesson, which is the first lesson where we actually get to dive deep into the very subject matter of this course, which is four-part writing in chorale style. In this lesson, there is going to be quite a lot of information thrown at you. We're going to be learning about rules and principles that govern four-part chorale style writing. You might find yourself asking during the lesson, how do I memorize all of these rules? The thing is that you do not have to memorize them straight away, but you do have to be aware of them. And for this reason, I would like to ask you to pause frequently during this lesson in order to have time to look at the examples, to study them, and most importantly, to take notes. At the end of the lesson, ideally, you should have created 1 or 2 pages of notes. And these notes should be a summary of the rules and principles that I will be explaining for you in this lesson. You will be able to consult these notes that you will have made today throughout the semester whenever you work on your chord progressions. This lesson is going to be divided into a few segments. First, I am going to explain to you this term, part writing and chorale style. Then there's going to be part 1, setting up the choir. Then part 2, doubling and voice leading. Then part 3, the rules of doubling. Then part 4, the rules of voice leading. And then in the 5th and final part of the lesson, I am going to give you some general suggestions and advice on what to do with all of that information. Let's go ahead and get started. Let's start by asking, what does the four-part chorale style mean? Well, the 4-part means that we are going to have 4 voices, just like in a choir: the soprano, the alto, the tenor, and the bass. The soprano is the highest one, and it is the voice that carries the melody. Then we have the alto, slightly lower, then the tenor, lower, and we have the bass, which is the lowest voice, which is providing the foundation for the chord progression. And what is the chorale style? Well, in the first half of the 18th century, there was a composer called Johann Sebastian Bach who lived and worked in Germany. And he wrote a few hundreds of pieces called chorales. They are pieces that are written for the choir, and therefore they are written for 4 voices, and they follow a set of principles. The following composers in the following centuries were very often looking back to Bach's chorales for a suggestion on how to write good chord progressions and good harmonies. So once you know what 4-part chorale style writing is, it is the time to jump into part 1 of this lesson, which is setting up your choir. Take a look at this chord progression. It is made of 3 chords, and this chord progression is an example of 4-part writing in chorale style. We have 2 staves, the upper one with the treble clef and the lower one with the bass clef. On the upper staff, we have the soprano and the alto, and on the lower staff, we have the tenor and the bass. Pay attention to the time signature and the key signature, which you will always need for every single chord progression. The next thing to pay attention to is the stem direction. In the soprano and the tenor, the stems are going up, and in the alto and the bass, the stems are going down. The last thing to pay attention to is the Roman numeral analysis underneath the chord progression, which is how we label the chords. Once you have set up your choir, it is important that you get to know the characteristics of every single of the 4 voices. These are the ranges of the voices. Feel free to pause the video and study them. The next thing about your choir is spacing. And there are 2 rules for spacing. You should never have more than an octave between adjacent voices. However, between bass and the tenor, anything goes. Take a look at the following examples of spacing. Which ones are okay and which ones are not okay. Feel free to pause and think of your answers. And the last thing to know about your choir is the position. There are 2 kinds of position, and both are correct, both are okay. There is the open position and the closed position. The closed position is when the upper voices are as close together as possible. When you cannot fit an additional chord tone in between the soprano and alto, or in between the alto and the tenor, this is when you have the closed position. Take a look at the examples of open and closed positions, and remember that both are okay, and changing frequently and going from an open to a closed position and reverse is a welcome procedure, and it gives you a variety of sound. Let's now move on to part 2 of the lesson. So in part 2 of this lesson, you're going to learn 2 terms. The first term is doubling, and the second term is voice leading. As you know, the basic building block of tonal music is the triad, and the triad is made of 3 notes. But in the choir, you have 4 voices. So what that means is that someone in the choir will have to double one of the pitches. When you are learning how to distribute the 3 notes of the chord across all of the 4 singers, this is when you are learning the principles of doubling. And this is when you are learning how to organize the sounds across the vertical dimension of your chord progression. And when you are learning how to write lines and how to connect one chord with another chord, this is when you are learning the principles of voice leading. And this is when you are learning how to organize and how to lead your voices across the horizontal dimension of your chord progression. Let's go into part 3 of the lesson, which is the rules of doubling. What are the rules of doubling? Rule number 1 tells you how to begin and end any chord progression. You should always start with the tonic and end with the tonic. In your tonic at the very beginning, in the first tonic of your chord progression, you should have 2 roots, 1/3, and 1/5. And there are no exceptions from this rule. For your final tonic, however, you have 2 options. Either 2 roots, 1/3, and 1/5, or alternatively 3 roots and 1/3. Rule number 2 is that any other chords in your chord progression, if they are not the beginning tonic or the final tonic, you can double whatever you want. Later on in the semester, you will learn that there are some situations in which certain tones should not be doubled, but for now, you can double whichever tone you want. There are 2 things to avoid, however. Avoid having 2 roots and 2/3. And also, do not ever omit the 3rd. So in every note, in every chord, you should always have a 3rd. Now, the 3rd rule of doubling is do not ever double a tendency tone. What is a tendency tone? Well, the tendency tones is a group of tones, and to this group belong the dissonances. For example, the 7th in the 7th chord. The 7th in the 7th chord is a dissonance, and therefore it is a tendency tone, and you should never double a tone like that. Another very important tone that belongs to the group of tendency tones is the leading tone. And you will learn what the leading tone is in the next part of this lesson. And that leading tone is also a tone that should never be doubled. In short, never double a tendency tone. In this part of the lesson, we are going to learn how to lead the voices. We are going to learn the rules of voice leading, how to lead the voices when we connect one chord to another chord. First, you have to know that there are 4 kinds of motion. There is an oblique motion, which is when one voice stays on its place and another voice moves. There is parallel motion, which is when 2 voices move in the same direction and they both move by the same interval. There is similar motion, when the 2 voices move in the same direction, but they move by different intervals. And there is contrary motion, which is when the 2 voices move in 2 different directions. Please take a look at the examples and pause and reflect on them and study them. Now, the first rule of voice leading is always resolve the leading tone in the correct way. First, what is the leading tone? The leading tone is the 7th degree of the scale. It is called the leading tone because the 7th degree of the scale leads us on to the 1st degree of the scale. So if you have a chord that includes the 7th degree of the scale that you are currently finding yourself in, then you have to resolve it in the correct way. If that leading tone is in an outer voice, you have to resolve it going half tone up. You have to lead from that leading tone onto the tonic, up a half tone. But if the leading tone occurs in one of the inner voices, in the alto or in the tenor, it doesn't have to resolve up a half tone, but it has only one other way to resolve. Take a look at the example, pause the video, and study it. The second rule of a voice leading is avoid parallel octaves, fifths, and unisons. If you have a chord and there is an interval of an octave between two voices in that chord, and then you have another chord and the same two voices, the ones that are an octave apart, move by parallel motion, this is when you have parallel octaves. And they are not a good thing, and they are always to be avoided. And the same pertains to parallel octaves and to parallel unisons. Take a look at the example and take some time to analyze it. Remember that parallel fourths are absolutely okay as long as they occur between the upper voices. If there are parallel fourths between the bass and the tenor, they are not okay, and they're also to be avoided. The third rule of voice leading is avoid hidden octaves and fifths. If you have two chords in which the soprano and the bass move in the same direction, and in the second chord they end up on an octave, these are hidden octaves, and they are not good, and they should be avoided. And the same pertains to fifths. So if you have two chords and your soprano and bass move in the same direction, and in the second chord they will end up on a fifth, this is hidden fifths, and they should be avoided. Take a look at these examples and ask yourself which ones are okay, which ones are not okay. Feel free to pause the video and take some time to think about the answers. The fourth rule of voice leading is avoid the melodic interval of an augmented second. It is extremely difficult to sing an augmented second, so do not ever ask your singers in your choir to sing the interval of an augmented second. The fifth rule of voice leading is avoid voice crossing. Voice crossing is when the voices are not kept in their hierarchical positions. So if the alto moves above the soprano, or the soprano moves below the alto, this is called voice crossing. Avoid voice crossing and always keep the voices in their own hierarchical space. The last, final rule of voice leading is avoid voice overlap. So if one voice climbs above the pitch that the voice above it just sang, this is called voice overlap. Or if a voice goes down below a pitch that the voice below it just sang, this is also voice overlap. And the rule is avoid voice overlap. This is the end of part 4, and we are ready to go on to part 5 of this lesson, the final part. Let's go into the last, final part of this lesson. The previous parts dealt with a lot of nitty-gritty about chorale style 4-part writing, which is a lot of rules and a lot of detail to remember about. But you should know that there is some kind of larger scale method that you should follow when you write chord progressions. First of all, remember that you will never have to write anything from scratch. There will always be something given for you in advance. For example, the Roman numerals, which tell you which chord you should write, or the soprano line or the bass line, which can imply certain harmonies. So the important thing for you to know are the notes of which every single chord consists. So you should know what notes make chord 1 in a certain key signature, or chord 5 in a certain key signature. You should always keep these notes in your mind. They are like the paint in a bucket of a painter. The second thing for you to remember about is that you should always start by writing out the outer voices, the soprano and the bass. So never start by writing all 4 voices straight away and then moving chord by chord. First, lead your soprano and lead your bass. Keep the rules of voice leading in your mind. And remember that leading the soprano and the bass, the more stepwise motion you use, the better. So avoid large leaps, and if you move by steps, that is always a very good idea, a very good thing to do. And use a lot of contrary motion. So it's always good when the soprano moves up and the bass moves down, or the other way around. Then once you have your soprano line and your bass line ready, you can fill out the inner voices. And the inner voices are very lazy. They should not be too active. They should not be moving too much. They are lazy and they like to stay on the place where they were. So when you move, when you lead your inner voices, try your best to keep the common tones, to not move the alto or the tenor too much. The inner voices are guided by the principle of going nowhere. They like to stay where they are. And once you have your outer voices and your inner voices, just spend 5 more minutes to go through your chord progression and search for any illegal parallel octaves and fifths. This is very important because at the beginning it might be difficult to notice the parallel octaves and parallel fifths. Remember that you can move as much as you want in parallel thirds, parallel sixths, and parallel fourths in the upper voices. But parallel octaves and parallel fifths are illegal, so it's important that you take an extra moment to look out for them. And if you find parallel octaves or parallel fifths, you will have to move around the voices, move someone somewhere else to avoid the illegal parallel interval. This is it for today's lesson. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your hard work. Congratulations.